That's the rule. We're dealing with something which I think is really interesting. The way that I came to this particular subject was the question of we came to the Amora Shmuel, and the Amora Shmuel has a particularly interesting statement, which took me down an entirely different avenue of exploration. So, if you will, I'm going to share my screen. Give me a moment here. Okay. Okay. So, today's discussion is going to be about the Hebrew calendar. And the reason that I decided to go into the Hebrew calendar is because the 3rd century Amora, Shmuel, who is a very important figure, he has something to say about the calendar. And so I wondered, was Shmuel a great astronomer? Is it possible that there was a great Talmudic astronomer who spent his days peering into, well, they didn't have a telescope just yet, but making astronomical calculations in order to help us understand when the new month would be, when the new year would be, all of those things. Excuse me. So I said, okay, let's jump down this rabbit hole. Let's see what's going on here. Now, we'll get back to Shmuel. I promise we'll get back to Shmuel. But what I really want to do is I want to just discuss the calendar a little bit. Then after we discuss the calendar in general, what we're going to look at is what the rabbis knew about the calendar. What do we know about the history of the establishment of the calendar? And, because you just get the calendar from Shaare Tzedek every year or from Chabad. Well, how does Chabad know what the right calendar is supposed to be? Right? Who set that up? So here goes. The Jewish calendar is called a Loony solar calendar because it is both lunar and solar. The Muslims are all loony, so to speak, because they are all in the moon, and the Christians are all sunny, because all they care about is the solar year. We Jews, we do both, right? We're sandwiched in the middle of these two celestial bodies, the moon and the sun. So let's just first examine what does it mean to be the Jewish calendar is solar. So what it means when we say the Jewish calendar is solar is as follows. So the Jewish calendar determines that that Pesach must come in the spring months. Et Chag HaMatzot tishmor shivat yamim tochal matzot. The festival of matzah you shall observe. 7 days you shall eat matzot, asher tziviticha lemoed chodesh haviv, which I have commanded to you to be at the time of the spring month. Ki b'chodesh haviv yatzatem miMitzrayim, because historically you went out of Egypt in the spring month. Therefore, the spring month must be for Pesach. That is in the book of Shemot. Again, in the book of Devarim, Shmor et chodesh haviv, guard the spring month. Vasita Pesach, and you shall do a Pesach in the spring month, Hashem Elokecha, for Hashem your God. Ki b'chodesh haviv botziach Hashem Elokecha miMitzrayim laila. God took you out in the spring month at night, right? So this tells us Judaism is a solar calendar as well as a lunar calendar. We'll get to the lunar in a bit, but the way that we know that we're a solar calendar is that you can have Ramadan in December, you can have Ramadan in June, Ramadan goes all over the calendar. Pesach, even though we follow lunar months and we're going to vary, everybody knows what the old joke is, right? The holidays are either early or they're late, but they're never on time, right? That's the Jewish understanding of the holidays. And so here, this tells us why it is that they always have to be in a certain range. The reason they have to be in that range is because Pesach needs to be in the spring months. Now, how do you know what the spring month is, right? sometimes I like to tell people in Vancouver there are two seasons of the year. There's July and August, and then there's everything else, right? Because it rains, rains. Then you have a sunny day and it's a little chilly. Rains, sunny day and it's a little chilly. And then you have July and August, right? And then we all schwitz and we all say nobody has air conditioning in Vancouver. And then secretly, lots of people put air conditioning in Vancouver because it really is a little hot here. But people forget between September and May or June, there's a lot of time to forget that people do have air conditioning in Vancouver. But so the question is, how do you know exactly when spring is? If the Torah is going to say that Pesach needs to be in the spring, so how do you know what spring looks like? So the answer is that the Tosefta in Sanhedrin. Why in Sanhedrin? Well, Sanhedrin is the particular tractate that deals with the courts, and the courts were responsible for establishing the calendar. And so it is going to give the courts a little bit of information about how it is that they're supposed to do this. And so it tells us, Ashlosha simanim ma'abrin tashana. There are 3 signs that you use to decide whether or not your Pesach is getting a little too early, right? So number 1, it could be that the crops are not ripe. Number 2, it could be that the fruit trees have not come to bear fruit. And number 3, the equinox may not have transpired, right? So you might ask, by the way, the question of if you look at the Hebrew, it says al shlosha simanim on. Did not want to do that one. Give me a second. It says on 3 simanim. So on 3 simanim. So it says the first one is al haviv, on the spring. If you look in various places where the Talmud discusses this, they talk about the fact that the crops are not ripe. Now, who cares whether the crops are ripe? Well, the answer is that the Omer sacrifice, which was always brought on the 2nd day of Pesach, came from barley. If the barley wasn't ready for that sacrifice, it could be a bit of a Dre cup, so to speak. And I imagine it doesn't work out so well when you try to grind and sift unripe barley. So this was something which was eminently practical, and so these were the signs that they used to determine when this was. Now, none of these things really require a telescope, right? The ripeness of the crop, that's very much on Earth. The fruit trees, very much on Earth. Even the equinox doesn't really require you to get out your astrolabe, right? If you want to measure the equinox, you basically measure how much sunlight there is in the day, and when it starts to inflect from being days which are getting longer to days that are getting shorter, that's going to be at the equinox. Okay. And it's also the day that when you have equal amounts of sunlight and darkness. Okay, so that's the sun. So far we've more or less covered the sun. Things are going to get a little complicated when we talk about the moon. Now, apologies, and this is where I want people to interrupt me if they don't understand. We are going to do math. I know it says Jewish history, right? What Rabbi? Are you an idiot? People do not sign up for Jewish history in order to do math, right? Okay, well, we have to do a little math. All right, here we go. The true astronomical period of the sun. So that means that if you went to NASA and you asked them how long does it take for the moon to do one revolution around the Earth, the answer is 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, 2.8 seconds. That's the very precisely measured one. Now, the rabbinical measurement of this same cycle is called the molad, right? And you probably have heard at some point in shul, when there's a new month, somebody gets up and announces the molad will be on Tuesday afternoon, 29 minutes and 4 chalakim after whatever, right? So that's announcing the appearance of the new moon. Now, what is what is the amount of time between those? So what do the rabbis say it is? So they say it's 29 days, 12 hours, pretty much the same so far. Now it gets a little weird. It says 793 halakim. So what is 793 halakim? So 793 halakim is a chelek rather is 1/1080th of an hour. There's nothing particularly sacred about a second or a minute. As far as I understand, minutes and seconds are good because 60 is multifactorial. Factorial. It has a 5 in it. It has a 3 in it. It has a 2 in it, right? And you can divide, and it's got 4 in it. You can divide it in all sorts of different ways. So 60 is a very good number to use for minutes and seconds. I'm just so 60 is very good. The rabbis decided that if you took an hour into 1080, it's also very neatly divisible, and so they just used a different way of measuring an hour. What this comes out to is that it shouldn't say 529. It should just say 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, and 3.3 seconds. So that means that the rabbis were really close, right? If you look at NASA's calculation, 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, 2.08 seconds. You look at the rabbis, 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, 3.33 seconds. So there's a 1 minute and 25 second difference between the two. So that really gives us a very accurate positioning. And that tells us that if it would take us 70,000 years to be off by a day, right? So we're in a really good position with that. And you might ask yourself, okay, well, how did the rabbis calculate this? The answer is that, well, we don't know that the rabbis necessarily calculated it, although it's very possible that they did. We do know that Ptolemy came up with a method of doing this, famous philosopher and astronomer. And the way he did this was by measuring the time between solar eclipses. Now, it's very hard to tell exactly when, if you measure full moon to full moon, it's very hard to tell exactly when the moon is full. If you went with your naked eye and tried to do this, it's actually quite hard to do, to decide at what point is the moon actually fullest, and when does it start to get to be just a little bit smaller in terms of its size. Very, very difficult, I would say impossible with the naked eye. There are a couple of other methods that people use, which are parallaxis, which is a very complicated way that. Hold on 1 second. I think someone's trying to get in. Maybe they figured out that it was on Zoom. Sometimes people call me. My phone number and my Zoom ID number are the same, so sometimes people call me on my phone number to get into the Zoom. Anyhow, let's back to the discussion. So here, there is this way called parallaxis, where you measure the angle from two separate places, and you can get some very interesting measurements. But from the historians I read, that said that Babylonian ships really didn't have a good way. They couldn't travel far enough to be able to do that, and so the way that in all likelihood they calculated this was with the solar eclipse. Now, what's interesting about a solar eclipse is that, as you know, this is when the moon blocks out the sun entirely. And in a solar eclipse, you have a very special view of things. You can see the exact moment of the full moon. So the exact moment of the full moon, you can then say, okay, let's wait for it. What's the exact second? What's the exact second that this is a total eclipse? And when does it then start to disappear? When do the edges of the sun start to wax in the sense that the moon is no longer blocking them? That's when you're no longer at the full moon. And so if you take solar eclipse to solar eclipse, which could be 11 years between them, 20 years between them, and you divide them, you measure the exact moment, you record that moment, and then you count how many months is in between these two, and then you divide by the number of months, you can know the exact period of time of the new moon. And this is how they established the exact to within, right? We showed that the accuracy here that the rabbis had for the moon was within 1.25 seconds of what modern astronomy can do with satellites and telescopes and computer analysis and all of those things. And so we can see that was a very, very accurate measurement. And this is the methodology that was used to get to that very accurate measurement. Here we find that that we start to see actually. I want to save the slide for later. Let's go to something a little different now. What our question is now is, well, what's the history of the calendar? What's the history of how we implemented that calendar? So we know that the following. It says, Rabbi Yossi said, if Purim occurs on a Monday, for if it occurs on a Monday, then the great fast Yom Kippur will be on a Sunday. And if it occurs on Shabbat, the great fast will be on Friday. All right, so just to make sure everyone's paying attention, how many months are there between Purim and Yom Kippur? So you have Adar, so Adar to Nisan. Iyar,
Sivan,
Tammuz, Av, Elul, Tishrei. Right? You got 7 months. There's 7 months in between them. So how did the rabbis know that if Purim is on a Monday, that Yom Kippur will be on a Sunday? This is a little if you are in a scenario, right? Let's remember what Moshe Rabbeinu was told. Moshe Rabbeinu was told, you see a moon like that, you see the new moon, then it's a new month, right? The way in which the calendar was established is the fact that what we assume that the way that the calendar worked was that there was a Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin waited for witnesses to come in. We have examples of that in the Mishnah. The Mishnah tells us stories about Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua ben Chanina, and the witnesses came and they said, I saw the moon like this, and Rabban Gamliel had a table with the moon shapes behind him, and they would say like this one, like that one, and that's how they would establish it. They would have witnesses come in. They used to serve a kiddush to make sure that the witnesses would come back the next month if they should see it. It was a kiddush in the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash because they wanted to ensure that witnesses would constantly come and they would establish the month. And we know also that one of the reasons that we have the second day of Yom Tov is because we didn't know when things were going to happen. We didn't know when those were going to be, and because we didn't know when the witnesses would come in, when they would see the new month. So then, if you lived 2 weeks travel from Jerusalem, in Bavel, in Babylon, for example, then you would have to wait for the witnesses to come. We've always assumed that the witnesses were the way that they established things. However,
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So Purim comes on Shabbat now, right? And I've never known Yom Kippur to be on Friday.
It's not. It isn't.
Right.
There's something called Lo Adu Rosh. We'll get to that at the very end.
Okay.
But those rules may have come in later. So, you're correct. But what does it say to us? What is the conclusion you take from the fact that if they knew which day of the week Purim was, they would know what day of the week Yom Kippur was? It
What's the
wasn't.
question?
What conclusion do you take from the fact if they knew what day of the week Purim was, they would automatically know what day of the week Yom Kippur was?
Well,
They
because
had
Purim is on the
they had a
14th
calendar.
of Adar, and Yom Kippur is the 10th of Tishrei, and so therefore there's 6.5 months in between. So if Purim is on a Monday, then that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, 7 days is the Kippur.
Yeah, but Annie, if a witness could become late, he could say he saw the moon late. If they weren't sure what would happen, how could you predict it, right? How do you know how many 29-day months you're going to have? How do you know how many 30-day months you're going to have in that 7-month period, right? You could have a lot of different permutations. Answer must be that already in the days of Rabbi Yossi, who's in the mid-4th century, likely this Rabbi Yossi is in the mid-4th century, they already had some version of the fixed calendar. That we'll talk a little bit about Hillel II. Most people will tell you, if you stop any well-educated yeshiva bacher and say, who set the intercalated calendar, he'll tell you Hillel II, Hillel the Nasi. But Hillel Nasi may have been the final, implementation. But it wasn't like this switch that up until Hillel the Nasi, it was, witnesses come, and then after that, it was what we call the intercalated calendar. It was a planned calendar. It seems to be there was a long evolution there. Also, who was in charge of the calendar?
The
Leviim, the Leviim.
No, not the Leviim. Remember, I told you which tractate you find a lot of this discussion in. In Masechet Sanhedrin. So it was the Sanhedrin that was responsible for taking the witnesses and establishing the new month, and also deciding what the year was going to be. Now, we don't have a lot of good information on this, but it seems unlikely that during the period where the Romans controlled the Beit HaMikdash and they controlled, they used to take the temple garments and keep them in the fortress to control the things going on there, it's very unlikely that they would be the ones to set the calendar. Now, it could be that they said the Roman calendar and the Jewish calendar overlapped. We don't know one way or another, but there are periods of time where we see much more discussion about how the Jews controlled their calendar, and these discussions all stem from the late period of the Tanaim, and most especially to the Amoraim. In the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries are most of the discussions about the calendar, which seems to suggest that there is a lot more activity about planning the calendar in the latter stages, and we see that there is going to be a greater and greater familiarity with the calendar in that sense, and maybe even greater familiarity with astronomy. We also see that the early knowledges, we see that already early on in the Tosefta, for example, we see that what if there are cloudy days, right? In Israel, you could have cloudy periods. November, December, January. What happens? Maybe you don't see the moon. So what would they do during those months if nobody saw the moon? Well, this Tosefta, the Tosefta which was compiled, let's say somewhere in the 3rd century, the Tosefta is going to say, you alternate months. We know more or less that it's 29 and a half days, so we're going to do this. Interestingly, when does Talmi come up with his calculation? Somewhere between the year 100 and 170. So this Tosefta is not that much older than Talmi. And so we're starting to see once again that as some of these went to the wrong slide. We're starting to see as some of these developments develop in the secular world, they are also being implemented in the rabbinic world. And here's another example of signs of a fixed calendar. Rabbi Ze'era said, it is reasonable to say, in accordance with the opinion of Rav Asi, that the sages considered the 2 days as one, and it is not a practice instituted due to uncertainty. As today, we know the determination of the first day of the new month. So, this particular discussion is a discussion that comes about with respect to the 2 days of Yom Tov. So let's just take a step back to understand this. Why do we have 2 days of Yom Tov? In Israel, they only have one.
Well, in case they got it wrong.
Okay, that is 100% true. In case they got it wrong, there is a more specific answer to this question.
Because of different time zones around the world.
This was well before time zones. This particular halacha is written in Rabbi Zeira. It lives around between 290 and 320 is the period in which he would be active, the third generation of Amoraim. So hold on, I'm just gonna mute participants, and please feel free to unmute yourselves. Or actually, okay. I think we're in good shape now. I want to leave people unmuted because I want people to have an easy way to interrupt, because like I showed you, some of the math can get complicated. I don't want anyone to get confused. But back to this question again. There was a time when they would let the Babylonians know. They would let the Babylonians know that they had established a new month. How would they do that? They would do it with signal fires. Now, I was so excited when I saw, I think, The Lord of the Rings. I think maybe it's the last one. I can't remember which one it was. Where they have to light this signal fire to let, the next kingdom know that they need them to come to war. And they have guys sitting on mountaintops, bored out of their gourd, but we have one job: see the fire to the east, and then light the fire so that the next guy to the west sees the signal fire. So apparently, this is exactly how things went. This is an early communication network. Light travels faster than horse. So you light a fire, and the guy on the next mountaintop sees the fire. He says, "Oh, they lit the fire. It's time to tell people it's a new moon."
But
Works
it takes
fantastic.
time. It takes 2 days until they get it to Bavel.
Yes, except for one problem. It's very easy to hack that network, right? And so, so the people hacked into that network and they lit false fires. So that was the end of that. So after they stopped doing the false fires, so then they used to send them on horseback. Well, that took 2 weeks. It takes 2 weeks to get to Bavel. So it could have been that they got there and they found that the Pesach was really too late. So in order to do that, the rabbi said, okay, it's better for us to have 2 days of Yom Tov. But now this particular rabbi says, today we know how to determine the first day of the new month. We can calculate it. We know, right? We know what that number is. That number is a number which is well known to us, right? That number was known to the rabbis: 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, 3.33 seconds. So you don't have to wonder. And so we see even already in the 4th century, Rabbi Zeira is saying, hey, wait a minute, I know this information. He lives before Hillel II, maybe slightly before, but he lives before Hillel II. And we're already seeing this sense of a fixed calendar. Here, we're going to see something else a little bit even more interesting. It says that, Rav Huna bar Avin sent this instruction to Rava. When you see that according to your calculations, the season of Tevet, right, i.e. the winter, will extend to the 16th of Nisan, and the spring equinox will occur after the 16th of Nisan, add an extra month to that year. Now, all of a sudden, we have a new factor that is entered into the picture. What's that new factor? The new factor is the equinox, that we're being told that the equinox has to come before you have Pesach. If you see that the equinox is going to come before Pesach, then we say you're going to have to add an extra month so that Pesach for sure is after the equinox. And what is interesting here is that we have this use of tekufa, which apparently also this idea of equinox starts to appear similarly in the 4th century in various Christian church calculations. And so we see that this was a development. The idea of starting to measure when this equinox was something which started to become prevalent at exactly the same time in several different cultures. So this tells us a little bit about that maybe the rabbis were really just working with contemporary astronomy, that the astronomy that the rabbis had was simply the astronomy that everybody else was using at the same time. Now, this tekufa idea is very interesting. Just to let you know about it, a little bit about the tekufa and how different calendars worked, we have now found a scroll from Qumran, from the Dead Sea sect. And that scroll from Qumran basically tells us that their calendar was 364 days. Summer was 364 days, fall was 364 days, winter was 364 days, spring was 364 days. Now, this worked out very well for Qumran because they didn't have enough years around to actually get into any trouble with their calendar, right? I mean, how long did the Qumran sect last? I don't know, 50 years, 100 years, you know? So at 100 years, they're a month off in the calendar. Nicht gefährlich, right? The Jews, this would be big problem for us, right? Because we would, at a certain point, Eliyahu Hanavi and Santa Claus would arrive at the same time, right? That's what would happen if we had a 364-day calendar. We've been around for 3,200 years. It would cause real problems. So that just shows you, that's just by way of comparison, there's another calendar out there that we now know of, the Qumran calendar, which was 364 days. But we have there is the Amora Shmuel. I told you that we were going to get back to Shmuel. Well, right? We said 3rd century Amora Shmuel calculated the solar year within minutes. We're now up to Shmuel. So the okay. Or actually, this is where we want to start with Shmuel. Okay. The vernal equinox. So Shmuel is going to give us. It's very interesting where this comes up. It comes up about how people aligned villages with the sun. But Shmuel says the vernal equinox occurs only at the beginning of one of the 4 quarters of the day, either precisely at the beginning of the day or precisely at the end of the night. Right? So this is a little bit strange. Why does the equinox have to occur at sunrise, or at night, or at midday? Like, what would be wrong with the equinox beginning at 10 a.m., right? And he says, similarly, the summer solstice occurs only at a certain time of the day, either the conclusion of 1.5 hours or 7.5 hours. What's the business of these very exact times? So the answer to this is the next thing. All of this is based on the principle that there are only 91 days and 7.5 hours between the beginning of one season and the next, as he assumed that a year is exactly 365.25 days. Just so you know, this text, I didn't give you the Hebrew because I was just wanted to keep things very clear. This text is the Safaria translation of Aruvin 56a. This section is probably a little bit more in their intermediate explanation part, but basically it's articulating the fact that the important thing you need to take out of this is that Shmuel says that the year isn't exactly 365.25 days. And each season begins precisely 1/2 planetary hour. So there are 91 days and every season is 91 days, 7.5 hours. But that turns out not to be strictly true. It is halachically true, possibly. We'll get to that later. It's at least halachically true for Shmuel. But the actual period is not 365.25, but the actual period of time is 365 days, 48 hours, and 11 seconds. There are 11 minutes and 14 seconds difference between the year of Shmuel and the year of NASA. So that 11 minutes becomes very, very important. It became important because of the difference between the Gregorian and Julian calendars, because they started to realize, I guess, that Easter was coming way too early, and so they had to add extra days to the calendar. But I want to just show you what this is from an astronomy perspective. So this is the sort of what it looks like, the sun's path. You can see in this diagram the sun's path on June 21st. The sun pass on March 21st or September 21st, and the sun's path on December 21st. So obviously the far left, the left top, is going to be the longest day of the year. The bottom is the shortest day of the year, at least in our hemisphere. And then the middle one is the equinoxes in the times in between. And you can see that the sun is going, the angle of the sun's rays is going to vary by 23.5 degrees each way over the course of the movement. Now, the interesting thing is that the poles, the Earth will spin on its axis the axis will be directly perpendicular to the sun's rays only on the equinox. Only on the true equinox will you be able to see that the rays of the sun are exactly perpendicular to the Earth. The position of the sun will be unique on that day, as will the amount of daylight and darkness will be equal on that day. And it also turns out that the seasons are not exactly equal. So actually, just to give you a bit of historical, before we get to the seasons not being equal, so it was in the year 1582 that, in Julius Caesar started it on March 21st, 1582, but by the time, the calendar of Julius Caesar, which by 1582 had fallen behind, and the day that should have been the equinox fell on March 11th. So to bring the calendar back, Pope Gregory the 13th took 10 days out of the calendar, and by declaring the day after October 4th to be October 15th. And he then instituted a leap year of one extra day every 4 years, except for years divisible by 100. Shmuel's calendar has no fix for this problem. So this is where some of these issues come. The actual lengths of the seasons are a little bit different. You have spring is 92, summer is 93, fall is 90, winter is 89. And you can see that some of the differences between the way in which it would be calculated for Shmuel and it would be calculated for the true astronomical time. Now, Shmuel is pretty good. He's only off by 11 minutes. That's not bad. But it's not going to be perfect. And one of the things that I think we come to understand in all of this is that the Jewish calendar and the Babylonian calendar have tremendous overlap. More than I had ever thought about before I got into the subject. But here's a couple of things to note. Number one is that there are linguistic parallels that we find between cuneiform documents and rabbinic texts. And I'm sorry, I read this article on this early on in my research, and I forgot to bring the exact linguistic parallels. My fault on that one. But it was fascinating to see that the rabbis are using the same language that we're finding for certain astronomical events. But more commonly, if you look in the Torah, what is Nisan called in the Torah? You will not find the word Nisan in the 5 books of Moses.
החודש הראשון.
Right, the Chodesh HaRishon. Linda, you're also right. He says, "Chodesh hazeh yeh lachem rosh chodashim," but it's not called a Chodesh hazeh. It said this month is going to be called first month, right? It's going to be the head of months. Everything in Torah is counted according to the Exodus from Egypt. So, in the 7th month from the Exodus of Egypt, you're going to have Rosh Hashanah. In the 9th month, you're going to have. Well, actually, it doesn't tell us when Shavuot is, but it does tell you in the 7th month you're going to have Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot. They're always referred to as the Exodus. Now, the Ramban has a very nice explanation of this, where he says that because of the exile, we shifted and we're no longer feeling the redemption of being redeemed from Egypt. Lovely. It's a very nice perspective, but it shouldn't be lost on us that the way in which we indicate the months is itself taken from the Babylonian system. And we saw that many of the innovations that were part of the astronomy of Egypt and Babylon, which were the best science of the day, were then incorporated into the rabbinic system of establishing the calendar. Now you might say, "Wait, Rabbi, this is antinomian heresy. You're telling me that the rabbis don't have a lock on science." So I think there's an interesting parallel here. Let's go to our current day, right? The rabbis do not have the most advanced knowledge on the coronavirus, right? It's not like people said, "Oh, there's a virus." Anthony Fauci does not call up, he doesn't call up the Aruvin Feinstein. He doesn't call up, Rav Herschel Schechter and said, "What do I do with this virus?" What is he?
He calls Bula.
Well, he goes to the scientists. Rabbis like Rav Asher Weiss, Rav Herschel Schechter, and others will turn. Now, there are a lot of different scientists out there. There's not one single scientist, and the science continually evolves. It's not a static thing, and it's not perfect, and it wasn't perfect, and I don't think we have to pretend it's perfect. But the rabbis are going to say, our role in this, we're not primarily scientists. We are consumers of science. And so as consumers of science, the rabbi said, okay, I'm going to go out and fetch the best science I can, and we will then apply that best science that we can to the halacha. But the science was not perfect. I think this is a very interesting insight into the way in which halacha used science. The rabbis were not the developers of the science, they were the consumers of the science. And they were consumers of the best science that they had. What do we find out? We find out that there may even have been a more accurate version of the calendar even than Shmuel. Who was that? It was the Tkufa of Rav Ada. Now, there's a very important book that is published in Barcelona, I guess at the beginning of the 12th century, by Rabbi Avram Bar Chia Hanassi. So Rabbi Bar Chia Hanassi writes the Sefer HaIbor, where he attributes, this is the book where it is attributed that the calendar was fixed by Hillel II. This is the very first reference that he actually references an earlier source, which is in the Gaonic period, but he is the source of the fact that Hillel II was the initiator of the calendar. He also brings to us a novel calculation of the year, which is off by only, I think, 45 seconds. This is the Tekufa of Rav Ada, 365 days, 5 hours, 48 minutes, and 997 1/80ths of an hour. So that means that here his Tekufa is 91 days, 7 hours, and actually I forgot to put the final calculation in there, but Rav Ada is much more accurate. And Rav Ada is the one that is actually used for actually planning the full calendar. Now, there are some who claim that even though Rav Ada is not mentioned explicitly in the Talmud, there is that one section that we looked at before, the fact that the equinox has to come out before Pesach, that only really works with the mathematics of Rav Ada. So it's implicitly there, but not explicitly there. But what do we see? We see, when does it become explicit? It becomes explicit in a Sefer HaIbor, in this treatise that is produced in 12th century Spain, where they have the luxury of Muslim mathematics and astronomy. So they're starting to get better and better at the calculation of astronomical phenomenon. Again, I think that this says to us, you know what? The rabbis don't have to be the cutting edge of the science, but they have to be consumers of the cutting edge of science. And that's, I think, one of the lessons that we see from the story of the calendar, is that the way that we see the calendar develop is a window into the way in which rabbis use science. It seemed to stay abreast of the scientific developments in astronomy over the course of ages, from the beginning of the period of Ptolemy to the 4th century Babylon to the 12th century of Spain. I'll tell you right now that there's a program called myzmanim.com, and that will tell you all of your astronomical events. It'll tell you when your sunrise is. It'll tell you when your sunset is. It'll tell you when you have to stop saying Shema, when you have to stop eating chametz, all of those times. And I believe it's linked to the U.S. Naval Observatory, which is meant to be there to give people very accurate times for these different kinds of events. So this is a science which is continuing even to this day. Maybe I'll just throw in a couple other. Well, okay, let me stop now for questions, and if we have time, I have some calendar tricks for you to see. Yes, Annie. You're on mute.
The Gregorian calendar has the months in order: 30, 31, 30, 31, and there's 2 31s in a row, July and August.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest are all 30, 31, except, of course, February being 28. And that equals exactly 365 days. But the Jewish calendar has 30, 29, 30, 29, and it has two 29-day months in a row, Cheshvan and Kislev. And the rest
Cheshvan and Kislev can be either 29 or 30.
Okay, maybe. And then, of course, they have the Adar Bet every few years to equalize it. So the question is, why did they do it this way and not do 30, 31, 30, 31, and then they don't have to add a whole entire month, but just have to add maybe one more day to one of the
adding of the month. The adding of the month goes all the way back to biblical times.
So,
and the reason you have to go 29-30 is because, leaving all the small math aside, the cycle of the moon is 29 and a half days, and we want to be dynamic with the moon. We need to be tied to the moon. We are a Loony solar calendar. The Christians have the virtue of being entirely solar. They don't care about the moon. We have
in the biblical in the Museum of the Land of the what is it? Sota Mikra, the
Bible Lands Museum. Bible Lands Museum.
Yeah, Bible Lands Museum. There is a whole discussion there on one of the walls that even the names of the months did not come at all from Hebrew. They all came from, well, I don't know from where exactly. I can't remember the details.
Yeah, they're Babylonian.
They have a table online.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
What, right, because the way we call the months, right, is we are now in Chodesh Hashini.
Right, but the names of the months are not Hebraic. Apparently, they
Correct.
come from ancient Hittite civilization or one of the.
Yeah.
I don't think they're Hittite. I think that these names are Babylonian.
maybe
Mesopotamian.
but they're not.
Both.
למה את מדברת באמצע? But they're not Hebrew Hebrew names of months, Hebrew words, that is.
Okay. Yeah, I believe I was modet to that fact, right? The months are the same as are the months are the same as the Babylonian calendar, right? Also, our months in the Babylonian calendar are the same months currently, right?
So if it comes from a foreign language and yet it says in the Torah Chodesh Nisan,
Wait, but that's what I'm trying to say. It never says in the Torah Chodesh Nisan. In the Torah, it says B'Chodesh Harishon.
Rishon. Okay, that will solve the dilemma. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, in the Chumash you will never see Nisan. You only see Chodesh Harishon. It'll tell you.
Chodesh Hashvi.
Yeah,
Chodesh
exactly.
Hashvi, yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, Rabbi, is this taking place at the same time as the Jews from Babylon were now coming back to Israel or have already come back to Israel?
Well after. So the Jews come back from the diaspora. Let me just pull up the date if I can.
I thought, wasn't that around 300 or something?
No,
70
it's about
years
580.
70 years after they left to go to Babel.
Hold on.
Oh, so it'd
I'd
be
like
like around
to-
140, 150.
No. It's like it's 4 something.
Oh.
Oh wait,
Because
here we
there's
go.
still
Yeah, I have it right.
people-
Give me 1 second.
Because there were still people alive who remembered what Bet HaMikdash used to look like.
Okay. They return. The declaration of Cyrus the Great to return is 538 BC. So they return in 538, right? Between 538 and 516, they first build the second temple. Ezra is 458. So that's sort of the rebuilding. Now, between Ezra, right, or from 160, this is all before the Common Era, that's when you have the Maccabees, right? And let's just pick the next important dates. The destruction of the temple is 60 of the Common Era. The writing of the Mishnah is 212. And then now a lot of these, so the dates that we're looking at here are the 3rd and 4th century, between the year, let's say the year 212 and the year 400. That's when most of this action is happening. Most of what we spoke about today is this is all Common Era dates, right? We're going up. So between, let's say, 220, 212, 220, and 400 is our window of where most of the text that we looked at today is. I admit we did jump to the 11th century, right? Contemporary of Rashi, more or less, with this Sefer HaIbor.
Rabbi,
Are there other records of communication with Babylonian
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I
mathematicians
chose
and
not to do,
philosophers?
and maybe this is something we're going to look at maybe next time, is there's a whole fight between the Babylonians and the Israelis over who got to control the calendar. That's possibly our next installment. So yes, there are lots of letters between, and then it reawakens again in the Gaonic period. So there's a lot of back and forth. The Jewish community in Babylon was a very, very old Jewish community, and it never disappeared. It never disappeared until 1952, I think. What was
52.
in 52 when
When the
they
Iraqis came,
Yeah.
when the Iraqis came to Israel.
yeah.
Rabbi,
So
what was
that-
the
Audrey, go ahead.
what was the time period when they were announcing the new moon from the fires on the tops of the mountains?
So that would presumably have been let's say sometime, maybe around the time of the Maccabees. It could have been anywhere between the year 160 before the Common Era to 60 of 66, 70 when the temple was destroyed.
Well,
It probably
what
even,
about
yeah,
what did they-
I'm sorry, it
what
could even have
did
been
they do?
after. It could have been after because there's the story about Yochanan and Zakkai and yeah, let's just say between 160 and 70, or even before that. Could have been even before that. It could have been from all already in the times of Ezra. Could have been from the time of Ezra, which is 416 458 to 70 CE.
Well,
So how did they
what would
count
they
it
have done
before that?
afterwards?
Wait, sorry, Audrey, and then Annie.
What would they have done afterwards to find out the new moon?
They would send horses, Pony Express.
Pony Express. Okay.
Yeah, Annie.
Well, didn't they declare the new moon every month, right when they came with Yoshua to Israel, and especially during the king's era?
Oh yeah.
David HaMelech-
Okay. So okay, fair enough. That may be true. I was talking about the times which would have been within recent memory of the Mishnah that the Mishnah could have recorded. But you're correct. There's an episode in Divrei Hayamim where Chizkiyahu may declare a month entirely differently. He may add a year to a month to the year. The rabbis weren't so happy about it, but we do have evidence of that. So yes, I don't mean to suggest it didn't happen then, but we were talking about I think the time period of when that could have been hacked with signal fires. And then they would have had to, those days they wouldn't have had to send out the fires because there was no Jews in Babylon. In Chizkiyahu, everybody was local.
That begs the question: why do we still have the two Hagim?
This is a whole other question. Okay, Tov. So you stayed with me. I guess nobody bailed on this one. So very proud. Hopefully you understood. There was a lot of math, but hopefully we succeeded.
It was interesting.
Thank you very much.
All right. All the best.
Very much. Thanks.